So the debt exchange is likely, having been executed, is likely to have a minimum cost, a minimum reputational cost on Jamaica. The more important question is, how big a benefit? Does it turn around the debt dynamics? And to answer that question, we looked at the path of Jamaica's debt from 1996 to the present, looked at the changes in the debt each year, and decomposed it, disaggregated the change in the debt each year into its constituent elements. We were trying to answer the question, what are the factors that cause the debt to GDP ratio to change from one year to the next? And to see if we can get some lessons from that to inform our expectations about how the debt to GDP ratio is going to change in the future. We identified 5 components, 5 reasons why the debt can change from one year to the next. And it essentially involves disaggregating into all of the factors that can cause a debt to change. The first factor is the difference between the government's tax revenue and its ordinary recurrent expenditure. Programs, wages and salaries, pencils and stationery. Leaving out one-off items, leaving out debt servicing. And we call this the government's housekeeping balance. The second component is capital expenditure. That is money the government spends on investing in highways and bridges and airport expansions. This too is a balance because you can have capital revenue, but capital revenue is not a regular item. It may come about when you have sales of assets. But in the absence of that, and in general, public investment is almost always has to be financed by some kind of borrowing. So this is almost always a contribution to additional debt. The third element of the government's fiscal accounts is debt servicing. Interest in particular, not counting amortization, just focusing on paying interest on the public debt. But we're not going to use the nominal money value of interest payments because that's not very informative. What we're interested in is the extent to which each of these elements contributes to additional debt, or in some cases, reduced debt. And so we adjust the nominal interest payment for 2 considerations. And I'm going to explain it by just using a quick analogy. When you borrow, let us say, take a mortgage from Jamaica National, of course, to buy a house, and they charge you an interest of, I'll use an example which is considerably higher than their interest rate. They charge you an interest of 20%. At the end of the year, the extent to which you need to find additional resources to pay that interest will be determined by 2 considerations. 1, housing prices. If housing prices rise by 15% over the course of the year, then at the end of the year, you can sell your house for 15% more and only have to find 5% to pay the rate of interest, to add on to make up the 20% to pay the interest on your loan. So change in price is one element. But if over the course of the year, you've actually rented out the house, then you've had some return on the investment. And again, for the sake of my example, if you've rented out the house for 5% of its value, then those earnings can pay the rest of the interest. And you will end up being able to pay off your interest based only on the rise in prices and on the return on investment. And so there's no reason for additional borrowing to pay that interest. we make those two adjustments to interest payments on the public debt. We adjust it for inflation because inflation tends to have an automatic effect on additional government revenue. In some years more, in some years less. But in general, it leads to additional revenue, and out of those revenues, debt can be serviced. And secondly, we make an adjustment for GDP growth, because the extent to which you have GDP growth is the extent to which you also have additional revenues out of which you can service debt. So our measurement of interest payments is real effective interest payments, net of inflation, and GDP growth. All three of those that we have discussed so far, housekeeping, capital expenditure, that is the public investment, and interest payments, constitute the overall fiscal balance that you see published more often than not. But there are two additional reasons why your debt can change. The value of an existing debt obligation can change. The most common example of this is where your debt is denominated in US dollars and the exchange rate changes. You haven't borrowed anymore, but since you're measuring in Jamaican dollars, the debt you already contracted has a higher value. There's another reason in our case, because we are measuring the debt to GDP ratio. We are measuring debt as the debt to GDP ratio. So if GDP falls, your debt to GDP ratio will rise. If GDP rises, your debt to GDP ratio falls. So the value of your existing debt, measured as debt to GDP, will change when GDP changes. The last reason, the final element, component of why the debt changes from year to year, refers to instances where an entity, a government, a company, a household, becomes indebted without having borrowed itself. This comes about because debts contracted elsewhere become the responsibility of the government. The most common example of this is the losses of public enterprises. But there are actually quite a range of examples. Government guaranteed debt. When government guarantees the debts of other enterprises and those enterprises fail to service those debts. And in some cases, government actually becomes responsible for debts contracted entirely in the private sector. That is what happened with the banking crisis and the bad debts being agglomerated into FinSac and FinSac debt coming onto the government's books. So liabilities contracted outside of central government, off-budget events, is the final component of our debt disaggregation.